Donc, bienvenue à tous à ce premier séminaire virtuel de l'Institut des sciences de la forêt tempérée, donc de son petit nom l'ISFAR. Ça nous fait vraiment plaisir de tous vous accueillir aujourd'hui. Comment ça se déroule aujourd'hui? On a un conférencière invité qui donne une présentation de 45 minutes. Puis après ça, on garde un 15 minutes à la fin de la présentation pour que le public puisse poser des questions. Donc, je vais modérer cette partie-là. Donc, n'hésitez pas si vous avez des questions. Je l'expliquerai plus tard, mais vous pouvez soit lever votre main, donc juste à côté juste en dessous de votre nom dans la barre des participants, il y a un petit endroit où vous pouvez lever votre main. Donc, comme ça, je saurai que vous aurez une question. Ou vous pouvez utiliser la barre de discussion de chat si vous voulez pour poser vos questions. Donc, n'hésitez pas. Si vous avez des questions qui surviennent pendant la présentation, vous pouvez déjà commencer à les noter. Donc, aujourd'hui, on a l'immense plaisir d'accueillir parmi nous Dalal Hanna. Dalal Hanna a complété son doctorat en sciences des ressources naturelles à l'Université McGill en 2020, ce qui est tout un accomplissement de finir son doctorat en 2020. Je pense que plusieurs étudiants peuvent reconnaître le défi que ça a dû représenter. Donc, elle travaillait sous la supervision d'Elena Bennett et ses travaux portaient sur les services fournis par les services écosystémiques fournis par les écosystèmes aquatiques. Elle est maintenant chercheuse postdoctorale à l'Université Carlton, ici à Ottawa, et elle s'intéresse à la conservation des écosystèmes aquatiques à l'échelle du paysage. Donc, elle continue de travailler sur les écosystèmes aquatiques. Elle s'investit aussi beaucoup dans les activités de vulgarisation. Elle a notamment fondé Riparia, un organisme de charité qui vise à initier les jeunes aux sciences aquatiques. Elle a également travaillé avec National Geographic Education, où elle va parler dans les classes, dans des salles de classe des sciences aquatiques. Donc, vraiment un parcours assez diversifié de sa part. Donc, aujourd'hui, je vais lui laisser la parole pour 45 minutes pour qu'elle puisse nous parler de ses plus récents travaux de recherche. Donc, à toi, Dalal.
Super, merci Audrey. Ça me fait vraiment plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui. Comme je disais tantôt en conversation, j'ai grandi à Ottawa, puis j'ai passé pas mal de temps dans la région de Ripon. Alors, vous venez d'une région que je connais bien puis que j'aime bien, qui est près de mon cœur, qui a sûrement été une des grandes raisons pour lesquelles j'étudie les milieux aquatiques aujourd'hui. Donc, je vais partager mon écran parce que c'est tout le temps le fun d'avoir des visuels. Un instant. On va faire ça. Bon, voilà. OK. Alors, c'est ça, comme Audrey disait, j'ai complété mon doctorat cet été, puis la recherche que je vais vous présenter aujourd'hui, c'est de la recherche que j'ai faite dans le cadre de mon doctorat. Je vais poursuivre la présentation en anglais, simplement parce que j'ai surtout l'habitude de parler de recherche en anglais, mais je suis également très à l'aise en français. Je suis franco-ontarienne à la base. Donc, si à la fin de la conversation, vous préférez poser des questions en français ou à la fin de la présentation, vous préférez poser des questions en français, ça va me faire plaisir de répondre en français aussi. So in the short time we have together today, I want to talk about the protection of watersheds and how that relates to people's well-being. Let's start by taking a step back and thinking about protected areas in general. So there's a large network of formally protected areas around the world. Now, when I say formally protected, what I mean is defined geographical spaces that are recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature. This is the IUCN's definition of a protected area. And these formally protected areas currently cover 15.2% of global terrestrial areas and inland waters. And there are many countries around the world that are working to increase the percentage of protected area coverage within their boundaries. In fact, just last week, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau pledged that Canada will work to protect 30% of its land and waters by 2030, an ambitious and exciting goal. And so as countries work to expand their protected area networks, it's important that they ask how and where this expansion should take place. And these are particularly important questions when it comes to freshwaters, because historically they haven't been a big priority in protected area planning. Instead, most energy has been put toward protecting charismatic terrestrial species and more recently toward creating marine protected areas. In fact, even to this day, the UN protection targets group terrestrial and inland waters into a single category, meaning that we could reach our protection targets, say the current protection target of 17%, without even having put any thought into what protection will specifically do for freshwaters. And that's a problem because freshwaters aren't the same as terrestrial systems. They certainly are connected to terrestrial systems, but protecting the critical habitat range of a charismatic terrestrial species, say, such as the lynx, for example, won't necessarily actually do much for freshwaters. And so coming back to these questions of where and how protection should be implemented, research is needed to answer these questions. In fact, research has a critical role to play in helping to understand the implications of protection and understanding how, where, and when protection status can best be adjusted, maintained, or put into place to achieve desired conservation outcomes. Now, when we're deciding what those desired conservation outcomes are, we need to start specifically thinking about conserving freshwaters because they're important. They provide habitat for numerous species, almost 1/3 of which currently face extinction, and they contribute to the provision of numerous ecosystem services. That is, the diverse benefits that nature provides to people. And freshwaters and the landscapes that they're connected to provide many different ecosystem services. For example, they provide fish like these walleye caught up in northern Ontario, which were a fantastic meal. They provide spaces to do recreational activities and experience a connection to the landscape. This is a picture of me and a friend canoeing, one of my favorite summertime activities, and certainly one of the reasons I'm so personally attached to freshwaters. They play a role in flood regulation. They provide drinking water that we all rely on, and they even contribute to global carbon storage cycles. Now, you might be wondering, what do all of these ecosystem services have to do with protected areas? Well, protected areas are of course embedded in ecosystems, meaning that they can contribute to the provision of numerous ecosystem services. And although for a long time, a large part of the conservation community mainly thought of protected areas as spaces set aside to specifically conserve biodiversity or preserve extraordinary natural features like a set of waterfalls, or the Grand Canyon, for example. Today, there's increasing commitment to integrate ecosystem services into protected area management. And there's interest in how protection can potentially be used to help conserve ecosystem services, which are unfortunately, several of which are threatened at the moment. And so this is made clear through targets like Aichi Target 11, which explicitly uses the term ecosystem services when it talks about desired outcomes of protected areas. That said, there are still many knowledge gaps concerning the intersections between formal protection and ecosystem services. And as countries work to expand their networks of protected areas and integrate ecosystem services into their decision-making processes, they require that these knowledge gaps be addressed. And so for most of my PhD research, I chose to work on addressing some of these gaps with a special focus on watershed protection. So to tell you more about this research, I want to start off by taking you to one of my favorite places. This is a beautiful lookout point close to my home here in Montreal, where I currently live. And one of the things that I love about this lookout point is that you get a great view of a typical rural southern Quebec landscape. Like many places in the world, this is a very multifunctional landscape. So there's a mix of areas that are formally protected on this landscape. There's unprotected forest patches. There's a ton of agriculture. There's areas with forestry, and in the background, there's a very big river or fleuve, the St. Lawrence. And because this picture was taken here in Quebec, where water is really plentiful, hidden across this landscape, there are numerous little streams like this one. And although subtle, these streams can contribute to human well-being in many ways. For example, they provide water to downstream communities. We do a lot of water extraction from surface waters in Quebec, and so these streams are important for providing that water. They provide nursery habitat for important fish species that some people like to eat. And they're also a place that people can go to have fun and dip our feet in for a refreshing experience with water. But in multifunctional landscapes where land use changes across the landscape, not all streams are equal. Some look a little bit more like this, with forestry right along their edges. So we see the stream going through the middle of the slide here, rocky patch with water in it, and along the edge, there's been a forestry cut. Others will look more like this, with agriculture all around them. And when I started to think about all these different streams embedded in the multifunctional landscapes that I live in, I began to wonder if, in spite of looking a little bit different, they could all provide ecosystem services equally, or if they provided them differently. And I wondered what that meant about our protection efforts. And more precisely, what I wanted to know, well, what are the effects of watershed land use, cover, and protection on stream and riparian zone ecosystem services and biodiversity? And I really care about this question because land use is changing around the world. We know development is increasing, forests are being cut down or turned into agricultural fields. Protected areas are, yes, being implemented, but also often degazetted, which means they're being decommissioned, basically. And as this happens, we really need to understand the impact of choosing to protect a certain part of the landscape versus implementing other types of land use management strategies when it comes to ecosystem service provision and biodiversity. This information is really essential to make informed decisions and avoid unanticipated consequences of land use change. And so I decided to conduct field surveys that would help us answer this question. I'll show you a quick video about kind of what this fieldwork looked like. So my colleague and I wanted to quantify 5 ecosystem services. We were looking at carbon storage, wild foods like the Labrador tea that you see in my hands here, water quality using several different indicators, recreational trails, habitat quality, and we were also looking at biodiversity, both terrestrial and aquatic. We did this work in 28 different streams that were surrounded by 4 different types of land use or protection statuses. So streams surrounded by forestry, these are unprotected streams. Streams surrounded by agriculture, again, unprotected streams. Streams surrounded by unprotected forest, and streams surrounded by national parks, which are essentially protected forests. We did this work in the province of Quebec, here in Canada, and our goal was to determine the impact of protection on ecosystem services. And so we visited 7 different national parks in the province of Quebec, which you see on the map here. And at each of those national parks, we visited 4 different but comparable streams, or for each of those national parks, we visited 4 different but comparable streams that had watersheds that were mainly occupied by these 4 different types of land use / protection status. That is, streams surrounded by national parks, unprotected forests, agriculture, and forestry. And then at each of those streams, we sampled a 100-meter segment of the stream where we looked not only at services within the stream, but also in 4 plots of the stream's riparian zone. Specifically, we were looking at this set of 5 different ecosystem services. And of course, streams provide many other ecosystem services, but we chose to focus on these both because it was feasible to quantify them in the field and because it turns out that they're services that appear to be important to Canadians based on a nature survey that was published in Canada in 2012. And so, of course, there are many different ways to quantify ecosystem services, many different aspects of an ecosystem service that we could look at. For example, we might be interested in looking at how much water quality is in fact provided to people or how much water quality people want. And those are 2 very different aspects of a service. In this study, I was really focused on the capacity of a system to provide ecosystem services. Now, before I get into the results of this study, I want to walk you through the indicators that we use to quantify each of these services. So for water quality, we looked at nitrogen and phosphorus, and we also looked at benthic invertebrate health, which is an indicator developed in the province of Quebec that's commonly used to assess water quality as well. It combines information about the abundance and distribution of benthic invertebrates. We looked at the provincial indicator of habitat quality that combines information about in and out of stream conditions. We looked at the amount and state of trails in the riparian zone of the streams we visited. We looked at the presence and abundance of 5 different wild foods that are important here in Quebec. And we looked at the kilograms of carbon stored by live trees in the stream's riparian zone. And so what did we find? Well, one of our main objectives in this study was to evaluate the overall impact of watershed protection on the amount of quality of ecosystem services and biodiversity. And so we put all our data together, split it up by these 4 watershed types, scaled and centered it so that it would be comparable, and then put that data into a statistical model called a permanova, which allows you to compare the overall amount and quality of ecosystem services across these 4 watershed types. I'll show you a few figures now to visualize the findings of this analysis. So this circle is showing the average amount of ecosystem services and biodiversity that we documented in streams that were surrounded by national parks. Now, each of the different colored triangles in the circle shows a different ecosystem service or biodiversity indicator that we measured in the field. And again, this data was scaled and centered and when necessary inversed so that it would be comparable. And the main thing I want you to pay attention to here is the amount of color that you see. More color means more ecosystem services and biodiversity. Now let's compare this to data that we collected in and around streams surrounded by unprotected forests. There are small differences here, but overall there's a pretty similar amount of color. Now let's look at streams surrounded by forestry. Less color for a number of different indicators. And what about streams surrounded by agriculture? Again, less color than in streams surrounded by national parks and unprotected forests. So we clearly visually see differences here, but what I'll do next is overlay the results of the permanova analysis to show you what the statistics say. So now I've added a letter to the top corner of each of these circles. And circles with the same letter are not statistically different from each other, whereas circles with different letters are, meaning that streams in national parks and streams surrounded by unprotected forests provide a similar amount and quality of ecosystem services, or this set of ecosystem services and biodiversity, whereas streams embedded in production landscapes where there's forestry or agriculture provide a different amount of ecosystem services and biodiversity. And so to me, what this figure is really saying is that watershed protection can help ensure the consistent provision of a high quantity and quality of a certain set of ecosystem services and biodiversity. And because we compared protected streams to unprotected ones that had similar land use and didn't find significant differences between them, we're able to confirm that these differences are at least in part driven by changes in land use. And this finding really helps shed light on one of the mechanisms that's driving differences in ecosystem service provision between protected and unprotected areas. It tells us that these areas are indeed different, but that protection affects this particular set of services in this way because of the effect it has on preventing land use from changing from a forest to an area where there's agriculture or forestry. Now, shifting gears, another important thing that you notice in this figure is that the impact of land use change and protection status is not the same on all of these different indicators. Some are more affected by forestry, whereas others are more affected by agriculture, and some don't really seem to be that affected at all by changes in watershed type. And in this research, one of the other things we wanted to do is understand these differences. So we also separately looked at the effects of watershed type on individual ecosystem service and biodiversity indicators using a mixed model approach. Now, I unfortunately don't have the time to walk you through all of these findings today, but I'll show you an example of the results and some of the interesting interactions that they reveal. So this is a figure showing data we collected on habitat quality and how it differs from one of the watershed types to the next. These are box plots, so they show the full range of data distribution. And the horizontal line in the middle of each of the boxes is the medium value that we documented. And so we have the habitat quality score on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, the 4 different watershed types. And each of the box plots shows data for one of the different watershed types. A higher habitat quality score means a better habitat quality. And so what we see here is that only streams surrounded by agriculture had a significantly lower habitat quality than protected streams. But what does that statistical difference really mean? Well, if we compare this to provincial norms about what these habitat quality scores actually indicate, we see that the difference matters biologically because practically all of the agricultural sites that we visited had what the government considers to be a marginal habitat quality, which can result in impacts on wildlife health. So why is habitat quality so consistently low in streams surrounded by agriculture? Why is there such a large difference between streams and protected ones and ones in agricultural areas? The answer is actually more complex than agriculture has impacts on habitat quality. It's also about the laws that govern land use management in agricultural contexts. So in Quebec, the law says that 10 meters of all riparian zones are not allowed any sort of major development, except in agricultural zones where only 3 meters are restricted from development. That means that in areas where there's forestry, although there may be forestry, it would be rare in Quebec to see forestry going right up to the edge of a stream. And so this difference in regulation between agricultural sites and other sites results in less stable vegetation in the 10-meter riparian zones, which means there's unstable banks, more sedimentation, and all that can negatively impact habitat quality. Now, I wanted to point this out because it shows that these differences that we observe aren't just about assigning protection status. It's also about the laws that govern land use outside of protected areas. These laws can have an important impact on ecosystem service provision. And this law doesn't only impact habitat quality. Agricultural riparian zones don't store as much carbon in trees as other riparian zones because they don't tend to have that many trees, because farmers don't tend to keep trees in those zones, or they might in fact cut the grass right to the edge of the stream, depends on the context. On the other hand, these riparian zones tend to have lots of raspberries because they're often left to grow as low shrub-like plants. And so you see here that there's a bit of a trade-off. Sure, there's less carbon stored in trees in these zones, but there's more raspberries, which is also an interesting ecosystem service. Now, another neat thing that our data suggests is that when these areas do have trees, they tend to have some of the most biodiverse species assemblages, meaning that there's room for policies to protect streams and riparian zone ecosystem services and biodiversity in production landscapes like this agricultural landscape. Because ecosystem services and biodiversity can also thrive outside of protected areas, but their ability to thrive will really depend on how land use is managed. So I hope that this kind of complex example has helped you to start thinking about the nuances of our findings and how biodiversity and different ecosystem services interact with land use management policies as well as between each other. Now, to me, the main takeaway from this study is that protecting watersheds can help ensure the continued supply of a high quantity and quality of biodiversity and a number of ecosystem services. We also learned that changes in watershed land use come with certain trade-offs. We need to be considering those trade-offs when we make land use management decisions, when we degazette a protected area because we need timber or food, and even when we decide that we're going to put a new protected area into place. My hope is that practitioners will be able to pick up this research and gain a better understanding of the role that watershed protection plays or could play on the landscapes that they manage. By knowing what the outcomes of protection are on ecosystem services and biodiversity, and how this compares to the impacts of other typical types of land use, we should really start to be able to make better informed decisions when it comes to land use planning. And this kind of information can really help anticipate the effects of our land use planning decisions, the trade-offs that result for them, and perhaps even come up with innovative mitigation measures in the context of watershed management. So if you want to read more about this work, you can check out the associated publication that's available in Conservation Biology. If you need access to it, don't hesitate to get in touch with me and I can send you a copy. But for now, let's move on to the next project I want to tell you about today. So the findings from the work that I just discussed make it clear that fully protected watersheds provide different amounts and qualities of certain ecosystem services relative to unprotected watersheds that have different land use. That said, it is very hard to fully protect a watershed. You'll notice that in this project, I was working in the watersheds of streams. So these are fairly small watersheds. But depending on the size of the water bodies that a watershed encompasses, these watersheds can span over large geographical regions. So for example, all of Canada can be split into 4 major watersheds. And designating the entirety of any one of these watersheds as a national park would of course be extremely complicated and probably not really desired, given that we also want and need space for activities like agriculture and forestry, as well as urban development, which aren't necessarily compatible with all types of protection. And so this got me wondering if watersheds that are fully protected, like the ones that I looked at during my fieldwork, do a better job at providing ecosystem services than those with smaller proportions of protection, like the ones on this diagram. I wanted to know, does the amount and spatial configuration of protection in a watershed really matter? And if so, what amount and spatial configuration of protection is required for the provision of which services? And I think these are really important questions when it comes to deciding where new protected areas should be put into place. We need to know, are there portions of watersheds that we should prioritize for protection? Should we have specific targets for the proportion of watersheds that should be protected? I mean, when Prime Minister Trudeau says he wants Canada to commit to protecting 30% of our country by 2030, does he mean 30% of our watersheds? Is that an approach that would finally allow us to set conservation targets that account for both terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems? And if so, which 30% of watersheds should we protect? So I'm definitely not the first person to ask myself questions about how watersheds can best be protected. There's a long history of literature on this topic, although it's quite small, probably because, as I was saying at the start of this talk, freshwater protection hasn't received that much attention. But there are researchers that have suggested really specific approaches. Take, for example, Abel and colleagues that came up with 3 potential approaches to watershed protection. They talked about prioritizing focal areas such as particular river reaches, lakes, headwater streams, or wetlands to support targeted focal species, populations, and communities. Or B, focusing on protecting critical management zones like river reaches that connect key habitats in upstream riparian areas to the critical downstream freshwater areas. Or C, protecting entire watersheds or catchments, which essentially are the same word, and then designating certain management zones within them that really focus on protecting the most critical parts of those watersheds. There's also Jean Nell and colleagues who suggest that we focus on protecting portions of watershed that have been identified as important for the provision of clean water downstream. And there's even research that looks at all the different parts of rivers throughout the entire world, assesses how much protection is currently found upstream of them, and suggests a novel means to calculate where there are sections of rivers that have insufficient protection based on targets like Canada's ambitious 30% or the 17% protection target, which is widely adopted by a number of countries that we're trying to achieve that target by 2020. Time is ticking, only a few months left. So overall, what I'm trying to communicate here is that we have lots of ideas of how to go about watershed protection. But it turns out there's actually not very much research looking at the outcomes of different approaches to watershed protection. There is a lot of work to be done in this research area for us to be able to make truly informed decisions about how we go about watershed protection. And one of the most interesting questions to me relates to the proportion of protection found in watersheds. We don't know if the biodiversity and ecosystem services supported by watersheds increases with the amount of protection found in a watershed. I personally kind of intuitively assume it does, but when I tried to find research supporting that, there simply wasn't very much out there. And I was really interested in this relationship between the amount of protection and different conservation outcomes when it comes to the provision of clean water. So I decided to conduct a case study assessing this relationship in Quebec. And I think Quebec is a particularly relevant place to ask this question because so much of our drinking water comes from surface water sources. And so as we work to expand our protected area network, we could potentially use information on how much watershed protection is required and where that protection is required to achieve desired outcomes like good water quality. And this kind of information could really help prioritize protection strategies here in Quebec and elsewhere. And so I located 2 water quality data sets from the province of Quebec. The first is the IQBP data set, which is an indicator of bacteriological and physical chemical water quality. This data set has 260 points in it, or it did at the time that I gathered this information. It's data collected over 3 years and then sort of averaged over a 3-year period, so it's very robust water quality data. And then I use the ISBS data set, which is a benthic invertebrate data set. And benthic invertebrates are commonly used as an indicator of water quality. And this data set has 220 locations across Quebec. And then I use geographic information system hydrological analyses to determine the proportion of protection in the watersheds of each of those points. Or in other words, I determine what proportion of the hydrologically connected area upstream of locations that had been sampled for water quality in Quebec were covered by a national park. Now, there are a couple of different ways that we can think about the proportion of watershed protection. So the first is the percent of protection in a watershed. This is a basic measure of what proportion of a watershed is covered by a protected area. So here you have watershed 1 with 25% protection and watershed 2 with about 50% protection. These are very approximate numbers. I just sketched these out. But the thing about this type of measurement is that 2 watersheds with, say, for example, 25 protection at very different locations would get the exact same score. And that didn't feel quite right to me, given that there could be something like an agricultural field downstream of this 25% protection, which we know influences water quality because literature has done research on this topic, investigating the relationship between agriculture and water quality. And so instead of using this approach, I used a distance-weighted approach, which adjusts the weight of protected area coverage in the watershed, so that protection that's located closer to the point of interest counts as more than protection that's located further away. And this measurement, unlike the other one, accounts for spatial configuration in the watershed. And so what did we find? Well, let's start by looking at what the data looks like. This is a figure showing information about benthic invertebrate health on the y-axis. So this is a common indicator of water quality, as I said. And on the x-axis, it shows a measure of the proportion of watershed protection, that distance-weighted measure I was telling you about. The colors and shapes of the points tell us about the amount of forest and agriculture in the watersheds of each of the locations assessed for water quality. And the dashed lines separate the water quality ratings according to ratings of good, precarious, and bad. These are ratings that were established by the government of Quebec. And one of the key things that I observe when I look at this figure is that watersheds that had some proportion of protection mostly showed good water quality, whereas watersheds without any protection had water quality that ranged all the way from bad to good. Another key thing that I observe is that among watersheds with some proportion of protection, those with lower proportions of protection don't necessarily have worse water quality than those with higher proportions of protection. This is not what I expected to find. So in other words, my hypothesis that if we looked only at watersheds with different amounts of protection, water quality would improve as protection went up. But in practice, what we observe is that among watersheds that have protection, those with higher proportions of protection don't necessarily have better water quality than those with lower proportions of protection. And so if we kind of ignore all of the watersheds that have 0 protection and just look at those that have protection, that observation line here is showing the trend in the data. And the results of the statistical analysis tell us something similar. So this is a figure showing the different predictor variables that we included in our model on the y-axis, and their relative importance in the best fit model on the x-axis. And then the numbers on the side are showing the average slope of that variable in the model and whether or not those variables were included in the best fit model and whether or not they're significant. I can break that down for you further later if you're interested. But the key thing that I want to mention about this figure is that the proportion of watershed land use land cover is a much bigger driver of water quality than the proportion of formal protection in the watershed. And the same is true in the IQBP data set, which is the other water quality data set that I looked at. So this is a figure, again, showing information about water quality on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, it shows a measure of the distance-weighted watershed protection. And the colors and shapes tell us about the amount of forestry and agriculture in the watersheds, and the dashed lines separate by these different ratings that were established by the government. And when I looked at this figure, I first thought, oh, okay, maybe there's some sort of trend there. It looks like The watersheds with a little less protection have less good water quality than the ones with high protection. I saw some sort of, maybe not linear, but different type of curve there. But the statistics honestly tell us the same thing as they did with the ISBS data set, with the other water quality data set that is, which is that watershed protection is just not the biggest variable driving differences here. Really what's driving differences is land use. And so these findings highlight how setting a target for protection to secure water quality is not as simple as increasing the proportions of protection in a watershed. And that's because the quality of water will also heavily depend on land use land cover in both protected and unprotected parts of targeted watersheds. And so as opportunities to expand the network of formally protected areas emerge, the findings from this work can really help determine appropriate strategies for practitioners seeking to use protection as a means to secure or improve water quality provided by watersheds. Specifically, the findings tell us that we can't just increase the proportion of protection in a watershed and assume that that will result in positive water quality outcomes, which was my assumption when I started this project. We actually need to be looking at land use throughout the targeted watersheds and working on putting mitigation measures into place so that land use around protected patches is compatible with desired water quality outcomes. That doesn't necessarily mean no agriculture in a watershed, but perhaps it means better riparian zones or different types of agricultural practices. If you want to find out more about this work, please feel free to send me an email and I'll be sure to share a copy of the article with you once it's accepted for publication. It's in its second phase of revision in freshwater science now, and I hope it will come out there soon, if not somewhere else eventually for sure. Okay, now coming back to the knowledge gaps that we discussed at the start of this presentation. We were talking about a lack of information about the specific contributions protected areas make to the provision of ecosystem services, and lack of understanding about how the ecosystem service concept can potentially help inform protected area management. The research that I've shared with you so far today tells us that assigning protection status to an entire watershed can help ensure it provides a certain quantity and quality of a set of ecosystem services, but that if we don't or can't protect the entire watershed, the land use in that watershed is going to influence the provision of some of those services, at least, like water quality. This research also really shows how looking at information about ecosystem services, like the provision of clean water, can help inform where and how we choose to establish and maintain protection status. But there are also lots of other ways the ecosystem service concept has potential to help inform protected area management. And today I want to finish off by telling you about one more research project that I worked on during my PhD, which showcases a different way that the ecosystem service concept can be used to help inform protected area management. So this project took place in a region just west of Ottawa, in the area of Pontiac, where various municipalities have been working for years to try and establish a park in the zone that's surrounded by a red box on the map here. So we're along the Outaouais River. We're not quite in a watershed anymore, but we're still in this kind of area where there's both freshwater and terrestrial ecosystem services that are provided, much like there would be, of course, in a watershed. Now, the thing is, when these organizations first tried to establish this park in the early 2000s, there was a lot of controversy. They had hired a private consulting firm to design the park, and the vision that the consulting firm came up with was not at all in line with what locals wanted. And so unfortunately, they had spent all this money, but the project eventually failed. Today, though, there's a local grassroots conservation organization that's still interested in gaining protection status for parts of the park or for the entire park. But they know that this is going to need to happen in a very different way to the previous effort. And another organization that works in this region is the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So all of the green patches that you see on the map here are actually parcels of land in this area that are protected by the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And I was working with the Nature Conservancy of Canada at the start of my PhD, and I had colleagues from there that were wondering if the ecosystem service concept may be able to help inform the next steps of this grassroots conservation organization so that they could think about how they might best protect this area. And so they put me in touch with that organization. And after chatting with that organization's director, I really thought that part of the conflict that came up when municipalities had tried to put a park into place here might have had to do with differences between desired and provided ecosystem services. Let me quickly explain what I mean by that. So landscapes provide people with ecosystem services, or in other words, they allow services to flow from nature to people. And that flow reflects the provision of services. That is the actual amount of services that people benefit from. Now, if the provision of services or demand for services are equal to each other, my guess is that we'll end up in a situation where people have pretty good relationships with the landscapes that they live in, and they don't really envision that landscape being used or managed in a different way. So there's very little potential for conflict when ecosystem service provision is equal to perceived ecosystem service demand. However, if ecosystem service provision and demand are different to each other, then there is strong potential for people to be unhappy with the relationships that they share with the landscape, and this can lead to conflict. And when I spoke to people from the community where this protected area was supposed to be established, what I found is that many of them were concerned that putting a protected area into place would in fact affect their ability to meet the demand that they have for various ecosystem services. Specifically, some people were worried that if the area was designated as a park, they would no longer be able to fish or use their ATVs, which are activities that are really important to them and have been for a long time. But the thing is, establishing a park doesn't necessarily mean losing access to these types of services. It can in fact mean gaining better access to these services and perhaps other services as well. Establishing a park can really provide opportunity to figure out what local demand for ecosystem services and see if there are discrepancies between demand and provision for services. And if demand is not equal to provision, well, perhaps we can figure out management actions that could be taken to improve service provision. And so thinking through all this, I decided that I would lead a project in this region, a very collaborative project focused on identifying pathways to reduce discrepancies between desired and provided ecosystem services. And so to do this, I worked with a team of stakeholder engagement and ecosystem service experts, and we collaboratively developed this novel three-part process. The first involved using a survey to identify key services that locals felt they benefit from in the region, and services that they would ideally like to benefit from but don't, as well as actions that they thought could be taken to improve service provision. And the survey was distributed to 14 different stakeholders in the study region, so that is organizations, as well as community members from many different types of community member groups. So that's farmers, hunters, fishers, recreational users. These are all kind of community members, where stakeholders would be something more like the municipality or a summer camp that has property in the area. The second step involved facilitating a participatory workshop with members of the community to collectively identify plausible actions that could be taken to improve local service provision, and also provide the opportunity to discuss potential trade-offs that could result from those actions, so that we could think of ways to mitigate those trade-offs. I'll show you a short video of this to give you a better idea of what this looked like. So workshop participants arrived. We had about 20 people at this workshop that represented different community members, types, and stakeholders. They settled into groups, and then I set the stage for the day, providing some background about why we were there and what we were doing. And then these groups went into our first group conversation, which was about their dissatisfactions in the region. So what are they upset about? What services do they not have access to? Then facilitators kept track. There was a facilitator at each table that kept track of these conversations and then reported back to everyone in the group about what had happened at their table, so that everyone in the room was on the same page. We then moved into our second group conversation, which was people's ideas of how to address these dissatisfactions. And then we had a full group discussion about the specific actions that we had come up with, and if anyone had any concerns related to those specific actions. And then the idea here being that we could use this workshop to really generate tons of information. I mean, the people that live in this region are the true experts of this region, and so perhaps they have ideas that that consulting firm didn't have about how to manage this new potential protected area. So step 3, after this workshop, I compiled all of the ideas generated from the workshop and survey into a report that outlined the actions that community members came up with and felt could be taken to improve local service provision, and talked about any trade-offs associated to those actions. This report was then shared with the different organizations and stakeholders we were working with, as well as local community members that were interested in using the results from this report to guide their next management actions in the region, including how to best manage the protected area that they hope to eventually put into place. And so quickly, one of the key parts of this report focused on using thematic content analysis, which is a method commonly used in social sciences, to assess links between the reasons why different individuals or groups were dissatisfied with service provision. So here that's blue and orange boxes, and relate those to proposed actions that community members collectively came up with to reduce dissatisfactions. That's shown in green, yellow, and a different shade of blue on this figure. And this is an example of one of the figures that visually shows the relationships between the reasons that people were dissatisfied with service provision and the proposed actions that people came up with. There's a lot going on here. I don't really need you to look at any of these details. The key thing that I want to say is that overall, our finding was that using this process, community members were able to identify plausible actions that could be taken to reduce most of the discrepancies that they felt existed between ecosystem service provision and demand. And so this was a fantastic finding, and it shows us that this process is constructive and could be picked up in other regions as a tool to help co-determine how people benefit from ecosystem service provision in a region, what actions can be taken to improve service provision. And this process, I think, could be especially useful in the context of existing protected areas where there are conflicts because of insatisfactions related to ecosystem service provision, or in contexts where new protected areas are going to be put into place and managers need to make decisions about what types of service provision will and won't be allowed or fostered within the boundaries of protected areas. So historically, these types of management decisions have often been made without input from local communities when it comes to protected areas. And changing that by using approaches like this, where there's really engaged participatory consulting and idea creation, can help avoid conflicts and that sometimes emerge when we assign formal protection status to new areas. And so it illustrates another type of example of how the ecosystem service concept can be used to help inform protected area management. Talking to people about how nature benefits them and how they relate to nature is something that people can really connect to. And that's what I love about the ecosystem service concept. Whether or not we need to use the words ecosystem services is not that important to me. What really matters is that it's this great framework to talk about all the different ways that people interact with nature, ranging from the fact that it provides us with water, clean air, to the fact that it's a place where we like to go use our ATVs. And so I think this concept has a lot of potential to help inform how we manage protected areas so that there can be better connections between people and place in protected areas. If you want to find out more about this work, you can look at the associated publication in the journal Ecosystem Services. It's called Identifying Pathways to Reduce Discrepancies Between Desired and Provided Ecosystem Services. And I'm going to finish up there for now. I want to thank all the co-authors that wrote these 3 different projects that I talked about with you today alongside me. It was very nice to be able to work with them. Lots of people that helped me out in the field and in the lab. I really appreciate their time. Different research partners, and of course, funding sources that make all this work possible. And now we can move into our question period.
Parfait, merci Dalal pour cette excellente présentation. Est-ce que des personnes en assistance auraient des questions pour Dalal? Vous pouvez les écrire soit dans le chat en bas ou vous pouvez aussi simplement activer votre micro et poser la question.
Ça va me faire plaisir d'entendre vos voix hein, parce que online, on ne voit pas trop la réaction déjà.
Pendant que les gens pensent un peu à leurs questions, moi je vais commencer avec une première question, puis les gens pourront ensuite poser leurs questions. Dans la première partie de recherche, Dalal, t'as vraiment fait le lien entre le fait que l'utilisation du sol et les services écosystémiques sont fortement reliés. Puis, tu as vraiment validé ça avec des données terrain. Est-ce que souvent l'utilisation de ça, c'est un bon en tout cas, c'est utilisé comme un proxy pour évaluer les services écosystémiques. Il y a beaucoup d'études qui font aucune évaluation sur le terrain puis qui utilisent ça comme proxy. Est-ce que tu penses que ta recherche confirme un peu cette manière de faire-là ou au contraire, tu penses qu'il y a des précautions à prendre?
Ouais, moi, je pense qu'il y a des précautions à prendre avec cette approche-là. Je pense que c'est vrai qu'il y a une corrélation entre l'utilisation du territoire et les services écosystémiques qui vont être fournis par le paysage. Bien sûr, en zone agricole, il y a de l'agriculture, puis en zone forestière, il n'y en a pas. Donc ça, si on parle de quantifier des services comme ça, ben oui, tout à fait, c'est une méthode qui est valable. Par contre, si on cherche à aller quantifier des services plus précises, comme par exemple les plantes sauvages comestibles, j'ai vraiment observé des grandes nuances entre les zones agricoles et non agricoles. Donc, c'est difficile dans les types d'espèces comestibles qui existaient. Bien sûr, en zone agricole, on va retrouver des framboises, tandis qu'en milieu forestier, on va retrouver des beurrés, du Labrador, par exemple. Mais donc, si on veut aller chercher des nuances en ce qui concerne l'approvisionnement de services écosystémiques, je pense que ça devient très difficile d'utiliser des caractéristiques comme des indicateurs, comme l'utilisation du territoire. Mais si on veut juste avoir un portrait global de ce qui se passe, surtout, disons, à l'échelle du paysage, ça peut être une bonne approche.
OK, merci. Je vois qu'on a une question de Raphaël Fréchon. Je te laisse la parole, Raphaël.
Oui, bonjour. Mais dans le fond, moi, je fais partie des étudiants là, qui vont discuter avec toi prochainement. Mais j'avais une question. Dans le fond, à la deuxième étude que tu as présentée, par rapport là, aux aires protégées ou à la surface avant les points de mesure, dans le fond, la surface qui était occupée avant les points de mesure. Moi, je voulais savoir si tu avais utilisé le concept d'aire équivalente de coupe pour les milieux forestiers. Je voulais savoir un peu, sinon, comme c'était quoi la différence ou si tu vois comme un potentiel d'améliorer justement cette mesure-là.
Ah ouais, tout à fait. Non, je n'ai pas utilisé la mesure d'aire équivalente de coupe. D'ailleurs, j'ai appris au sujet de cette mesure il y a quelques semaines, puisque mon postdoctorat va vraiment se concentrer sur cette question de coupe forestière. En fait, dans les résultats du premier projet que j'ai présenté, une des questions que je me suis demandé, parce que moi, j'ai regardé des bassins versants où il y a eu plus de 40 % de coupe. C'est tout. C'était ma seule contrainte. Fait que ça pouvait être n'importe quelle sorte de coupe. La coupe pouvait avoir lieu n'importe où dans le bassin versant, ce que j'ai essayé de contrôler en utilisant le distance weighting measure. Par contre, les coupes pouvaient avoir lieu à différentes années. Et donc, ça, je pense, moi, personnellement, à l'époque, je m'étais dit, il y a vraiment possibilité de différence de réponse si la coupe elle a eu lieu il y a 15 ans ou la coupe elle a eu lieu il y a 2 ans. Donc, c'est pas quelque chose que j'ai considéré dans ni un ni l'autre des projets que j'ai présentés aujourd'hui. Puis je pense que ces deux analyses-là pourraient être grandement améliorées en se posant cette question-là. Et c'est ce que c'est un des projets que je travaille dessus en ce moment dans le cadre de mon postdoc, essayer de comprendre la foresterie à long terme, c'est quoi les impacts à long terme de la foresterie? Est-ce qu'on voit que ça récupère très rapidement ou est-ce que ça prend plutôt du temps? Est-ce que la récupération est linéaire ou pas? Puis en utilisant des aires équivalentes de coupe, je pense que je peux vraiment commencer à mieux répondre à cette question. C'est quelque chose que je compte faire, mais que je n'ai pas fait dans ces projets-là.
OK, super, merci.
Merci, Raphaël. Je vois qu'il y a une question de Samuel Collin-Latour. Je te laisse la parole.
Allô, Dalal. Moi, j'ai une première petite question parce que je connais pas beaucoup ça. Parce qu'au début, tu as montré la carte où il y a plein d'aires en rouge qui sont comme protégées. Puis je me demandais, au milieu de l'océan, comment quelqu'un fait pour savoir qu'il est dans une zone protégée? Comment c'est délimité? Puis c'est quoi les barèmes pour ça?
Je peux pas exactement répondre à cette question parce que je me connais pas beaucoup en milieu protégé marine. Je sais qu'on a établi certaines zones protégées en milieu marin et que c'est très, très, très difficile de les surveiller et de s'assurer que les lois qu'on essaie de faire appliquer dans ces milieux-là soient réellement appliquées. Ça dépend du type d'aire protégée marin aussi. Il y a des aires protégées marines qui vont permettre à certains types de pêche, mais pas d'autres. Mais bien sûr, quand on a des aires protégées marines en plein milieu de l'océan, il n'y a pas un patrouilleur qui est constamment là. Puis ça, en fait, c'est un problème non seulement dans les aires protégées marines, mais dans les aires protégées partout au monde. Il y a une étude qui est sortie il y a quelques années qui est vraiment superbe, qui regarde est-ce que les aires protégées qui sont catégorisées sous certains types de catégorisation dans les standards de l'IUCN respectent réellement les standards. Et la réponse semble être que non. Il y a beaucoup d'aires protégées de type parc national qui ne seraient pas censées avoir de foresterie dedans, par exemple, qui en ont. Et donc, juste parce que c'est protégé sur papier, ça ne veut pas nécessairement dire que c'est protégé en réalité. Tout comme, juste parce que c'est pas protégé sur papier, ça ne veut pas nécessairement dire que c'est pas protégé en réalité. Si on pense à la quantité de gens au Québec qui ont des grandes terres à bois qui essentiellement sont comme des aires protégées parce que ces gens-là, ils vont faire de la petite coupe sélective extrêmement durable, c'est un autre type de protection, c'est juste qu'elle n'est pas officiellement reconnue. Donc, c'est toujours important de penser à cette nuance quand on pense à la protection.
Puis, si je peux, là, une autre question vraiment plus technique qui devrait être courte. Là. C'était quoi le contrôle dans tes... J'ai compris que tu avais comme 5 réplicas qui étaient des 5 bassins versants. Est-ce qu'il y a un contrôle? Est-ce qu'il y avait quelque chose que tu considérais comme un contrôle dans ces 5-là? Ou...
En fait,
Parce
il y avait 4
que le
types
parc
de
national...
Il y avait 4 types de
Le
bassins
parc
versants.
national. OK.
Et le contrôle, c'est... je regardais 2 affaires dans cette étude-là. 1, l'impact du statut de protection, puis 2, l'impact de l'utilisation du territoire. Alors, pour ajouter un élément de contrôle, j'ai regardé des bassins versants qui avaient une utilisation du territoire essentiellement le même à ceux des aires protégées. Donc, c'est de la forêt, comme dans les aires protégées, mais ils ne bénéficiaient pas d'un statut de protection. Et c'est en utilisant cet élément-là de contrôle que j'ai la possibilité de dire, OK, la différence qu'on observe entre les bassins versants qui sont protégés et ceux où il y a de la foresterie ou de l'agriculture n'est pas techniquement due à l'état de protection. Elle est due au fait que c'est une forêt, selon les résultats que j'ai eus. Est-ce que ça clarifie?
Okay.
Pas tout à fait.
Je ne suis pas certain, mais merci.
Je peux essayer de répondre d'une autre façon ou peut-être dans notre discussion après, on peut vraiment se plonger là-dedans puis je peux en discuter plus en détail.
Laisse-moi, ça vient de couper pour moi. Allô?
Dalal disait qu'on pouvait continuer dans la période de discussion, Samuel, pour essayer d'amener d'autres exemples pour répondre à ta question. OK.
Merci.
Je vais prendre... merci, Samuel. Je vais prendre 2 dernières questions, puis après ça, je vais laisser... je vais conclure le séminaire d'aujourd'hui. Donc, Antoine, je te laisse la parole. Antoine Mathieu.
Oui, merci. Bonjour, moi je suis étudiant là, à la maîtrise à l'ISFOR dans un projet qui touche là, aux bandes riveraines puis aux haies, dans le fond, agroforestières. Je me demandais par rapport aux observations que vous avez faites en milieu plus rural, là, où il y avait de l'agriculture, ça ressemblait à quoi les bandes riveraines? Est-ce que les gens comme respectaient le 3 mètres beaucoup? Est-ce que il y avait beaucoup de différences dans ce que vous avez vu? Puis c'était pas mal tout similaire, comme la même chose?
Donc, j'ai visité à peu près une dizaine de ruisseaux agricoles dans le cadre de ce travail-là et autres, mais une dizaine qui répondaient aux critères qui m'intéressaient. Puis 7 ont été retenus pour des raisons de comparaison entre différents ruisseaux. Et je dirais que la loi n'est pas si souvent respectée au Québec. La loi des 3 mètres, c'est-à-dire. Il y a d'autres fois où elle l'est, puis des fois, c'est même beaucoup plus que 3 mètres de bande riveraine en milieu agricole. J'ai trouvé des ruisseaux vraiment entourés par de la forêt pendant plusieurs mètres, jusqu'à même 100 mètres. Mais dans tous les ruisseaux, pas mal tous les ruisseaux que j'ai visités, j'ai trouvé des sections où il y avait un 3 mètres, ou peut-être il n'y avait pas de 3 mètres, ou le 3 mètres... On pouvait se poser la question, c'est quand la dernière fois que ce 3 mètres-là a été coupé. Généralement, les gens, ils ne plantent pas dans les 3 mètres. Ils n'ont pas de plants qu'ils vont récolter, mais c'est pas un espace qui est maintenu en bande riveraine vraiment. Puis ça, il y a des municipalités qui vont plus, des inspecteurs dans des municipalités qui vont plus mettre en pratique la loi et d'autres qui ne pourront pas pour des raisons politiques et sociaux. Ça devient extrêmement compliqué. Il y a eu beaucoup de résistance de la part des fermiers. Tout comme il y a d'autres fermiers que ça les excite tout à fait, cette histoire de bande riveraine, puis ils ont des subventions de leurs organismes de bassin versant qui vont venir leur aider, ils vont planter des arbres, qui vont faire de la rétention de sol sur le bord de leur bande riveraine. Fait qu'il y a vraiment un mélange de... J'ai observé un mélange de réalité dans les bandes riveraines.
Puis ça affectait beaucoup, j'imagine, là, la qualité des habitats ou est-ce que vous avez pu voir?
Ben, je peux pas, tu sais, j'ai peut-être pas la puissance statistique de vraiment tirer des conclusions là-dessus. Là. L'expérience n'a pas été créée pour poser cette question-là. C'est clair que moi, mes observations démontrent qu'en zone agricole, tu as des différences entre les zones agricoles et les zones protégées. Oui. Puis je pense que c'est peut-être en grande partie à cause de la bande riveraine, mais aussi à cause de ce qui se passe dans le bassin versant, honnêtement. Tu sais, je pense les bandes riveraines, 10 mètres, c'est à voir à quel point ça a un impact. Puis l'autre affaire, c'est qu'au Québec, on a beaucoup de tile drainage. Je ne sais pas c'est quoi le mot en français, là, mais c'est comme dans le fond, on a des champs agricoles, puis en dessous des champs, il y a des espèces de tubes qui passent parce que les gens, ils ne veulent pas que l'eau s'accumule dans le champ. Fait qu'il y a des tubes qui passent en dessous des champs et qui vont directement au ruisseau et qui jettent tout le ruissellement directement dans le ruisseau. Fait que quand tu as ce genre de circonstances-là, une bande riveraine, elle n'a pas vraiment la capacité de faire grand-chose. Elle ne peut pas agir comme filtre parce que l'eau, elle est apportée directement du champ au ruisseau. Donc, c'est aussi à considérer dans le contexte québécois.
D'accord, merci beaucoup.
Merci Dalal et Antoine. Et je vais prendre une dernière question de Emina Ali. Je te laisse la parole.
Bonjour, moi je suis une étudiante à la maîtrise, puis je travaille sur l'ADN environnemental des tortues qu'on a au Québec. Ma question, c'était dans la partie 2 de votre présentation, vous avez regardé, bon, il y avait une figure avec votre 25% ici et votre 17% que vous avez ajusté en fonction de s'il y avait un terrain agricole qui était proche ou loin de la zone que vous regardiez. Parce que ça avait une influence ou un impact sur les résultats. Je me demandais, est-ce que vous avez utilisé un modèle, en fait, je ne sais pas à quel point la zone ou la région est divisée en différents types d'habitats ou à quel point c'est fragmenté, mais est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui a regardé l'hétérogénéité et comment on appelle ça en français? Je pense que c'est hétérogénéité des types de parcelles. Donc, est-ce qu'on a 10% du territoire qui est agricole? Si tu as une zone, par exemple, à 100 mètres ou à 1 kilomètre de votre aire protégée, versus est-ce qu'on a 10 petites parcelles ou 10 petites fermes qui sont un peu partout dans le territoire. Donc, distance et interconnectivité d'un gros territoire fermier versus 10 petites fermes qui sont un peu réparties partout.
Oui, je comprends bien la question, puis c'est une question très intéressante. Le groupe de recherche dans lequel j'ai fait mon doctorat a plusieurs publications à ce sujet-là sur cette question de connectivité puis de habitat heterogeneity. Ils vont souvent utiliser un programme qui s'appelle FragStats dans ArcMap pour pouvoir regarder, exemple, avec FragStats, tu peux regarder un bassin puis avoir un indicateur un bassin versant, désolé, puis regarder à quel point le bassin versant avoir un indicateur de fragmentation. Fait que ça te dirait, est-ce que les parcelles de type d'utilisation du territoire qu'on voit dans le bassin versant sont rapprochées les uns des autres ou pas. Dans mon cas, j'ai décidé d'utiliser la mesure, le Distance Weighted Measure, comme indicateur de la configuration du bassin versant. Fait que c'est un indicateur que j'ai développé avec Bernard Leiner, qui est un hydrologiste à McGill, qui a créé le jeu de données de Hydrosheds, qui est vraiment, vraiment pratique pour des analyses d'eau ou hydrologiques. Super modèle global pour pouvoir regarder comment l'eau file à travers les paysages. Puis, dans le fond, ce que nous, on a fait, c'est que pour chacun des points qu'on avait, on a regardé en amont de ce point-là, puis on a regardé c'est quoi la distance de les pixels. On travaillait à une échelle de 90 mètres par 90 mètres. Et donc, chaque pixel de 90 mètres par 90 mètres, je savais est-ce que c'est agricole, est-ce que c'est forestier, est-ce qu'il y a eu de la coupe ici, est-ce que c'est anthropique. Et ensuite, j'attribuais un poids à la mesure finale selon la proximité de ce pixel-là au point qui a été évalué pour l'eau. Donc, c'est pas exactement la même affaire qu'utiliser un programme comme FrogStats. Et en réalité, je pourrais peut-être faire ça aussi. Ça serait sûrement complémentaire. Mais, tu sais, on a déjà des gros modèles avec bien des paramètres. Fait que personnellement, je pense que l'idée d'utiliser un distance weighting va chercher cette composante de configuration du paysage. Puis, il y a aussi de la recherche qui démontre... Moi, en fait, j'ai fait l'analyse d'abord avec les mesures juste de pourcentage dans le bassin versant et qui ne considéraient pas la configuration de l'utilisation du territoire. Et je n'ai pas vraiment observé grande différence entre les résultats en ce qui concerne l'impact de la protection. C'est vrai que ça avait une influence sur l'impact des différentes utilisations du territoire. Mais dans mon cas, dans les deux analyses, on voit que la protection, c'est vraiment moins important que l'utilisation du territoire.
Merci, merci.
Bon, et merci à tous. Merci pour les questions intéressantes aussi, soulevées à la fin de la présentation. Donc, merci Dalal pour cette fantastique présentation. Moi, je trouve que c'est un masterclass dans la présentation d'une recherche. Vraiment, c'était vraiment magnifique comme présentation. Donc, si on était tous ensemble, il y aurait certainement une main d'applaudissement à la fin du séminaire, comme on le fait habituellement.